Hi, Michael. Perry. Thank you.
Reading glasses instead of cheap. Just right. Well, part of the trouble is my glasses because it's very addictive. Just
All right, good morning. Good to have you with us this morning. We have some visitors with us. You're very welcome. And of course, we would invite you to any of our services. And for those of you who we don't know well, we look forward to getting to know you better later this morning. But for now, we're going to study the Word of God together. And we continue this morning our study of faith by considering what the Scriptures say about two men who are presented in that great chapter of faith, Hebrews 11. We noted last week that the Lord has revealed to us that he who desires to be righteous and approved by him shall live. And when the Scriptures here say shall live, they mean to eternally enjoy the presence of God. That is, that the righteous shall live by faith. And so it's critical that we understand what faith means. And it is the objective of our study together this quarter. And by his kindness, God has not left us without any guidance or understanding, but asks us to draw conclusions from his word, from the many direct statements that he makes, and also from many examples, both of those who were faithless, where their accounts are given in the scriptures, Paul talks about those in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11 when he says, these things happen to them as examples for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. But also examples of those who were faithful. And in a similar statement, Paul talks about those in Romans 15 and verse 4. For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope. I think I mixed those up. But both passages, 1 Corinthians 10:11 and Romans 15:4. So in our study this morning, as we mentioned, we'll consider two men. And these two walked the earth during the first centuries of the world. We'll talk about Abel, who was, of course, the second generation from Adam. And we'll talk about Enoch, who was the seventh generation from Adam. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you so much for the opportunity to call upon your name, even this morning. And we ask special blessings right now on our study, and that we would understand the things that you have left for us, that we would gain insights and then have the willingness to apply them in our lives because of our love for you. We especially thank you for our Lord and Savior Jesus, and for what he has done for us, that we might have hope. In his name we pray. All right, let's begin our study in Genesis chapter 4. So we'll start with our study of Abel. And in our study today, we'll be, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the questions that we passed out last week for this lesson. For our lesson next week, there's a handout also in the back, so be sure and pick that one up to guide our study for next week. All right, so let's start our study in Genesis chapter 4. We want to read verses 1 through 5. Now the man, of course, Adam mentioned here, now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I've gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. And again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks. Cain was a tiller of the ground. And it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the ground. And Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became angry, and his countenance fell. All right. What I want to do first is just learn directly from the text. What do we learn directly from the text? So I'm not asking to make conclusions, connect with other passages. Just what do we learn from this text on the face of it? What are some things we learn? 5 verses.
Be pleasing to God by doing his will.
Okay. Abel was pleasing to God in his offering. And we're going to learn more, as Brother Roy says, why that was. But we learned that Abel was pleasing to God when he presented an offering to God. What else did we learn?
Cain was firstborn.
All right. Cain was firstborn of 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. Good. What else? Yeah, go ahead, Joe. This isn't hard question, so go ahead.
Cain
Yeah.
worked the soil while Abel kept flock.
All right. We had a farmer and a shepherd. Good. What else? Yes, Miss Joanne, welcome.
I don't remember ever paying attention to this before, but Eve gave credit to the Lord for her son.
Oh, Eve gave credit. Yes, Eve gave credit to the Lord. Eve tells us in these first verses of the Bible that God is the source of all life, right? God didn't wind things up and let it go. All right, good. I didn't write that down either. These brothers were what with respect to God? What are they doing that we're also doing? Worship. They were worshipers of God, right? These two brothers were worshipers of God. Yeah. And when they brought their offerings, was it not from their own labors? Each one from their own labors. Mm-hmm. And as a result of those offerings, what was the result? So we mentioned that Abel was approved. And Cain? He was not approved. Neither he nor his offering was acceptable. Okay? All right, this is what we learned. Now, let's think about our passage in Hebrews chapter 11. The text for this part of our study is in Hebrews 11 and verse 4. So in Hebrews 11 and verse 4, now looking back to this account in Genesis, the Hebrew writer says that it was by faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. All right. Now, let's think about what we learned from the text here. First, we learned that Abel's sacrifice was what? It was acceptable.
By faith.
That it was offered by faith, yes?
More excellent. We live
More
our lives
excellent.
still speaks even after we die.
Oh, okay. Even now, his faith is still speaking. And Chuck, you said it was more excellent. That is, it was accepted. It was better than the sacrifice of Cain. Yes, please.
God didn't say it wasn't excellent, but now out of what I get out of this, it was more excellent. Though it wasn't a bad one.
Yeah, we're told that it was, well, we're just told that it was better than Cain's.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
If we stick with the text, it was better than Cain's. Was there another hand? Yes, ma'am.
First of all, they had to know what the will of God was in order to obey that or not obey that.
Good. We're going to talk some more about that. That's right. Good. Why was Abel called righteous? This involves a little bit of judgment to decide about how the verse flows.
No, he did as he was instructed.
Okay, that's true. In the verse, that's true. In the verse,
His offering demonstrated that he was righteous.
okay, that's true. So what? Let's read the passage again. Through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous. So from the beginning, by faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice, through which he obtained the testimony. I'm going to suggest that the which in this verse, through which, is not the offering, but rather his faith. It was through his faith that he obtained a better testimony. Yes, it was demonstrated through an offering, right? That was a demonstration of the faith, by which, through which that faith he obtained a better testimony. All right, these are the things that we learned. Okay, so if we think about the questions on the handout, I mentioned it was by faith that Abel offered a sacrifice to God, and through faith that he was called righteous by God. Verses that we just talked about. Now let's then turn and get a little bit into this first question, which our brother Roy and Althea have pointed us toward in terms of the answer, and that is, according to Romans 10 and verse 17, we'll start there, and then 1 John 3 and verse 12, what was necessary for Abel's offering to have been by faith? So to answer that question, let's go over to Romans chapter 10 and read a little bit of the context from of the verse that I pointed you to, Romans 10 and 17. We're going to start then in verse 13. Now Paul is making an argument here about how both Jew and Gentile can understand how to be right before God. And that they both have access to being right before God equally. And we pick up in verse 13 where it says, for whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? How will they believe in him whom they have not heard? How will they hear without a preacher? How will they preach unless they're sent? Just as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news of good things. However, they did not all heed the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report? So, faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. All right. Now, he begins here now, in our context, whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, this is a quote from Joel, and it's not the only place in the New Testament. Peter used this in Acts chapter 2. And we could turn there and develop some of these same ideas. But let's just stay here in the context. Let's think about what it means to call on the name of the Lord. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. In the scriptures, to call on the name of the Lord means to appeal to God for favor, to rejoice in his salvation. It's related to worship and presenting offerings. And the first time it's mentioned is here in our context in Genesis chapter 4. Now it's in the context of Seth, but the writer says there that in those days, these men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, I think a really insightful passage to understand what it means to call on the name of the Lord is Psalm 116. And we won't read that today, but I wrote in my Bible in the margin of Romans 10:13, Psalm 116. The whole context, and 3 times in that passage, the author talks about calling on the name of the Lord. And when you look at what he associates with that, then I think you get a very good understanding of this idea of appealing to God for salvation, rejoicing and being thankful for that salvation as being associated with this concept. Okay, so let's keep that in our mind. Appealing to God and for salvation, and then rejoicing in that salvation. Now, in this passage, Paul is quoting out of Isaiah in Romans chapter 10. And it's in that section right before very familiar passage, Isaiah 53, that talks about the suffering servant, the one who would bring salvation to God's people. All right, so now in Isaiah 52, verses 6, right before Isaiah 53, in Isaiah 52, verse 6, God says, therefore my people shall know my name. So when we think about whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved, and we ask the question, well, how do we know the name of the Lord? How do we know about his salvation? How can we call, if we don't know that, then, how can we then call upon God? And the Lord says in Isaiah 52, verse 6, therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore in that day I am the one who is speaking. Here I am. God is revealing himself. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who bring good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness. This is the passage that Paul is quoting here in Romans chapter 10, where God is saying, I am revealing myself, and blessed are those who take the revelation that I am giving in myself and bring it to others. Who announces salvation, not only of who I am, but also the salvation that I bring, and says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your watchmen lift up their voices, and they shout joyfully together, for they will see with their own eyes when the Lord restores Zion, which is a phrase that talks about bringing salvation to his people. So the good news of salvation from God is preached here in Romans 10. And men and women, they hear the good news. They hear the revelation from God about himself and his salvation. And here in Romans 10, what do? They believe it. How can they believe unless they have heard, right? They believe that. And then they appeal to God. They call on his name. They appeal to God on the basis of what they have heard for favor. This is how they call on the name of the Lord. All right. So when we think about that, hearing the good news from God about who he is and the salvation he brings, believing it, and then appealing to God for favor on the basis of that news, calling on the name of the Lord, I want to take a pause just for a minute before we continue to develop. And just think for each of us, how do you and I call on the name of the Lord? Because if we were to continue to consider this idea of calling on the name of the Lord, I think we would agree that this is not a one and done. There is a sense in which calling on the name of the Lord is done at the time of, let's say, initial salvation, when we are restored to God as one of his children. But it's a continual process. Like even back in Genesis 4, men began to call on the name of the Lord. It's a continuing process. So let's think for a minute. How is it that you call on the name of the Lord in your life? What does your appeal to God for favor look like?
Search the scriptures.
Okay, Roy suggests that one way that he is appealing to God for favor is that continual process of searching the scriptures to understand what God's truth is. You know, if we were to go around the room this morning, which we won't, and describe the way we regularly rejoice in his salvation, what would that sound like? So it's a pause just to think. Are we calling on the name of the Lord as we should? Yes, David.
I can't help but think that verse 16 probably has a key to that, because
Yes.
he was talking about Isaiah there, and he said, but they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report?
Yes.
So this believing that report has to do with their obeying what
Okay.
they know to do.
So not everyone that heard the good news responded in the same way. And what David is bringing up is that as we continue on, Isaiah is talking about not everyone has believed our report. And Paul's commentary about what that means is, or what that includes is, not everyone has heeded or obeyed that good news. So when we appeal to God for his favor and his approval, that is to say, when we call on the name of the Lord, what must characterize the way that we do that according to this passage?
I think the study of the scriptures shows thyself approved unto God.
Okay, it has to start with an understanding of his will. It does. And it's followed by believing, which includes then obedience, right? It is characterized by hearing, believing, and obeying. And what is that called in this passage? All faith. All faith. Mark?
Well, think about Jesus. Jesus gave us a definition. Why do you call me Lord?
Yeah.
And do not obey my commands.
Very good.
That's part of this calling on the name of the Lord. Not just somebody save me,
Not just saying it.
but
Yes.
it's somebody specific. I'm calling upon the God of all gods, the Lord of all lords, to save me.
Good.
And as you said, it's not a one and done. It's not that I'm going to walk with the Lord long enough for him to pick me up and dust me off.
Right.
But I'm going to continue to walk with him because I'm going to call. He's my Lord, and that's the beginning. There's a relationship that's implied by the use of this word of the servant to the master.
Very good. Even the name. That's right. All right. So the question was back at the beginning, right? What was necessary for Abel's offering then to have been by faith? Knowing what we know about what faith is from Romans 10, what then was necessary for Abel's offering to have been by faith? Yeah, Joe.
To hear, believe, obey.
Hear, believe, and obey. That's right. In other words, as someone had mentioned before, we know for certain, even though it's not in Genesis 4, that God indicated what he wanted in terms of worship. Because Hebrews 11 tells us that Abel offered by faith, and faith comes from hearing. And so, even though it's not in the passage in Genesis 4, we know that that's true. Abel's offering in every respect, then, in order to be pleasing, had to be aligned with the revealed will of God. Now, that is in accordance with what John says in 1 John 3:12, the other passage in our question, where John is comparing others. John is bringing a comparison that involves Cain. And in that passage, he says, not as Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Now, I guess it's possible that John is referring to Abel's life in total. But what do we know of Abel's life is very small. And it is this offering, which we know is acceptable to God. Right? So let us just at least apply this verse to the offering of Abel. All right, his works were righteous. Now, the word righteous means, well, to be what?
Do what you're told.
All right, it is. It's about to being right. It's about being upright or guiltless. That is, if you look in the lexicon, to be aligned with the will of God, to do what you're told. That's right. And therefore, again, lexicon, to be approved by God. So even this passage, when John says his actions were righteous, John is saying, by the very words he uses, that Abel's actions were aligned with the will of God. Otherwise, it couldn't be righteous. So what then do we conclude about Cain's offering?
Didn't follow the instructions.
He didn't follow instructions, yeah. All right, that's right. He didn't follow the instructions. Again, no revelation about... Now, how did he not follow the instructions? We don't know. We have to start guessing about that. Because we don't know what the instructions were. But we know that this was about following instructions. Whether it was in the spirit or it was in truth of what he did. That was the difference. And that is the difference of faith and no faith. That's what Abel is teaching us here. All right. Good. So, before we go to question 2, any comments or things you want to add? I wonder, Michael, if you could just back that that clock up, maybe 30 minutes, so we can... I don't know what you're doing up there. All right, let's compare God's testimony of Cain and Abel to the prologue of Hebrews 11:4, which is found in chapter 10, verse 36 through 39. I'll take it through 38, I think. Okay. Now remember, we studied this last time, Hebrews 10:36. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come, and not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. All right, so from that prologue, and what we have noted so far, again, why was Abel accepted and Cain not accepted? What are some words in here that are associated with living by faith? I'm thinking about verse 36.
The will of God.
You've done the will of God, right? When you've done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. All right, let's be clear. We won't develop this now, but let's just be clear that as Paul builds out the book of Romans and talks about calling on the name of the Lord and being and my righteous one shall live by faith, as he mentions in that book, that it's very clear. Paul makes it clear in Romans that we are not perfect people. Okay, when we talk about having done the will of God, we're talking about a course of action, not a state of perfection. We're going to develop that more as we think about faith and faithfulness in our class. No one here is saying that Abel was perfect. That's not what the Hebrew writers. And in fact, it's really so we need to think, even though faith, the word faith, integral to the word faith, integral to the action of faith is obedience to God's will. The righteousness which comes from faith, which is given by God, does not require us to be perfect in every respect. Okay, so we're going to build that out more, I think, when we talk about Abraham's faith. All right. So I'm going to switch over to Enoch with the rest of our time, which is about 20 minutes. Everybody okay with that? All right, so the genealogy goes something like this. It goes Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. All right, so those are the first father-sons in the history of the world. And when Lamech, so that's Noah's father, was a young man, all of his male direct ancestors, all the way to Adam, were still living. Adam lived to what? Over 900 years old. So that hasn't happened in a long time. Except for one, of course. Except for one. Enoch. Enoch was not walking the earth anymore. And Lamech was. And it wasn't because he died, right? Because he was taken by God. Let's read in Genesis chapter 5. Verse 21. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay, question number 3 was simple question. What characterized Enoch's way of living? No, he did as he was instructed. That's true. What does the text say?
He walked with God.
He walked with God. Yeah, twice he walked with God, right? So we wanted to kind of consider the meaning of this phrase, he walked with God, which is given without explanation here by comparing to some other, well, even Old Testament verses. And we could also do that with some New Testament verses, often walking. What are some walking phrases in the New Testament?
Walk by faith.
Walk by faith.
Walking in the light.
Walking in the light. One used in Ephesians a lot. Walk in the
Knowledge.
Thinking about spirit, although I won't argue with you, Joe. Walking in the spirit. Okay? These are some New Testament phrases we could learn from. But I'm going to stay with the Old Testament since, well, we're reading in the book of Genesis. And let's just start with Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 12. Okay? So Deuteronomy 10 and verse 12. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul? Okay, when we think about the insight to the phrase walked with God, what is the most direct insight from this verse? Brother Roy has mentioned it.
Do as instructed.
Okay, do as instructed, to walk in his ways, right? That's what Moses says here. To walk in all his ways. What else is associated with that in this verse?
Loving and serving God.
Loving God and serving him, right? With everything that you have. All of your desire, all of your effort. What else?
Heart, soul, and mind.
All right, heart, soul, and mind. That's right. All that you have.
Keep the commandments.
Yes, keep the commandments.
Part
Yeah.
of it's fearing God.
Fearing God.
Respecting.
That's right. It's a great awe and respect for God is here. Very good. All right, so these are the things that are associated with walking on God. Walking in his ways first, but respect and awe, loving him, and serving him with everything that you have. All right, how about Joshua 22 and verse 5, which reads, "Only be careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." All right, what's the most direct insight that helps us understand walking with God? To walk in what? All his way. Joshua 22, verse 5.
Walk in all his ways.
All his ways and all his commandments, right? Joshua says here, reminding them. All right, what else is associated here? Some of the same things, right?
Hold fast to him.
Hold fast to him is added here. Holding fast. What does that bring to your mind? Holding fast.
Staying on course.
Staying on course, right? Okay. Keep on doing. Holding fast. What else could it mean? So holding fast meaning staying on course, continuing to follow him. And what else do we think about holding fast?
Clinging to God.
Clinging to God, yeah. Hazel's got a baby back there clinging to her right now. Sleeps. Comfort, right? Love. All right. What else here? Let's see. So we had serving him, loving him, holding fast to him. Good. Micah 6 and verse 8. Familiar passage to us. Probably Tom has, stitched this also. It's probably hanging in his house. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. What is the most direct insight that tells us something about what walking with God means in the Old Testament scriptures? With what? Humility. All right, it's got to be in the top. But if you look at the scriptures about what God respects, which is a really strong word, I think, of respects in man, that is considers in his extension of mercy to humility, humility, humility. You even think about the kings of Israel that would have put probably the people of Noah to shame. And in their humility, he turns from his wrath. It's amazing to me. Walk humbly with your God. That is what he requires. And what is associated with that here? Doing justice, loving kindness. That is to say, following the example of the Lord. Doing as in a character that he has. So, walking with God. Enoch walked with God. What does that mean? It means that he followed his ways and followed his commandments. It means that he patterned himself after the character of God. It means that he loved God. It means that he was motivated by a fear and respect of God. And God honored him as a result. Well, how does the Hebrew writer describe Enoch's walk? In Hebrews 11:5. That reads, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And he was not found because God took him up. But the Hebrew writer gives us a little bit more commentary about that. Why? Why did that happen? We know that Enoch walked with God, and we know that he was taken up. We know a little bit about what walking with God means. Now, the Hebrew writer says he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was what? He was commended. He had the testimony that he was pleasing to God. If you had an aspiration for your life, would it not be to be pleasing to God? What aspiration could be more important, more critical than to please God? Now, we might say it in some different words. There is none. There cannot be any, right? I often ask people, and it's in a business context, I say, well, what is your aspiration? And so they tell me about what job, what kind of position they want or what kind of work that they do. But sometimes in the context of those conversations, it's appropriate for them to think about and to respond about something broader than their work. Because our work, well, I'm not saying the impacts of our work can't have spiritual pieces to them, but generally speaking, when we go and work and we get money for that work often will burn up. It'll just burn up. It'll be for nothing. But the aspiration of pleasing God lasts eternally. And that was the testimony that Enoch had from the creator of the universe, that he was pleasing to God. Is it possible to be pleasing to the creator of the universe?
Apparently.
It's not only possible, it is what? It's desirable and even more. It is required. It is required to be pleasing to God. Absolutely. Can we do that on our own? No, right? And it is by what? It is by faith. Our part is faith. Hear, believe, trust, obey. That is our part. It is required for us to be pleasing to God. And if we fail in that, there is destruction. Yes, sir.
I think when you walk with somebody, communication is a possibility.
Yes, very good. Very good. Amos even says, can two walk together unless they what? Are in agreement. I think that's exactly what you're saying, Jerry, is that Amos is using that for a different purpose, but when he says that, he's saying we all know that. When we walk together, that figure of walking together implies agreement. All right, good. David, I think you had something.
And there in verse 6, which follows exactly what we're saying here in Hebrews,
Yes.
it says that without faith, and that's a faith we're talking about,
Yes.
that it's impossible to please God.
Good.
So that's how important it is.
So what is God? What is the Hebrew writer here, the Holy Spirit, indicating about Enoch in following verse 5 with verse 6? So we know Enoch pleased him, and what is he then indicating?
That it took that faith to please
That's
God.
right. That Enoch had faith, right? I mean, it says by faith, right, in verse 5. But now, what else do we know about faith from verse 6?
Essential.
It's essential for sure. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. And what else do we know then about Enoch because of that connection between verse 5 and 6? What do we know about his faith? How would you characterize it?
Pleasing to God.
It was pleasing to God, yes. That is absolutely right.
Well, apparently he demonstrated that. Because it says before he was taken,
Yes.
that he demonstrated his testimony
Yes.
that he pleased God.
He did. He was pleasing to God, which means we know for certain that he had faith. It's mentioned in verse 5. We know from verse 6 that without faith it's impossible to please him. And what else do we know about Enoch's faith? By connecting verse 6 with verse 5.
There's a reward.
Okay, there is a reward. That's not about Enoch's faith, but that's a truth. That God has prepared a reward. And what do we know about Enoch's attitude toward that reward?
Drew near to God.
He drew near to God, that's true. Because he believed what?
That he is.
That he is, first of all, right? He believed not just that some higher power exists, or whatever. But rather he believed in the God that had revealed himself. That he is who he says he is. That's absolutely right. What else did Enoch believe?
God's the rewarder.
I'm sorry?
God is the rewarder of those.
That's right. That God apparently had some promises that he was trusting. Right? And so he believed that God would keep his promises. That's right. And if you look in the seek him part, the seek him, some versions say add the word diligently because that's the force of the word. So what else do we know about Enoch's faith? It was active, right? He diligently sought, as Cindy said, diligently sought, earnestly sought after God. Good. So, again, the Hebrew writer is writing here, and he's just unfolding for us through these examples from the Old Testament. We haven't even gotten past 7 generations yet, and he's already starting to unfold for us in a rich way what it is that, what kind of faith God respects. We've already, let's see, I think we have a little bit of time. David said to Solomon in 1 Chronicles, the 28th chapter, as for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. That sounds like walking with God. For the Lord searches all hearts, and he understands every intent. And if you seek him, the promise is he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. So now, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, David says to Solomon, I observe and seek after all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you might possess the good land. Enoch's belief in who God was, his trust in God's promise, and his obedience in seeking after what God said to do, his faith, was the reason he was pleasing to God. That's what the Hebrew writer says. Okay. Remember the exhortation of the purpose of the Hebrew writer. Let's go back and connect with the purpose of the Hebrew writer. He is exhorting the Hebrew brethren not to what? Draw back, right? But to keep moving forward. Not to throw away their confidence. It's interesting that the Hebrew writer calls what they have with respect to God confidence. It's a pointer to the faith that they had demonstrated in the past in God and in his promises, and specifically in his promises that came through Jesus Christ. And not to throw that away, to continue to believe and trust in the reward, right? From Hebrews 11:6. They needed endurance. And so in these first, all of Hebrews 11 is about demonstrating how faith is what is pleasing to God. You look at verse 2. By it the men of old gained approval, all the way to the end of this section in chapter 11. And our study will go beyond chapter 11, by the way, into chapter 12. But all the way to the end, where he talks again about gaining approval. These Hebrew brethren needed the reminder that in order to be pleasing to God, they had to continue in faith. All right. Next time we'll study the faith of Noah. As I mentioned, there's a sheet on the back for guiding our study next week. Thank you.